Welcome to this IPstack tutorial where we'll be using IPstack and Node and Express to build a backend server that handles incoming requests from a front-end client, forwards the IP address of that request to the IPstack API, and then analyzes security data provided by IPstack to determine the threat level of that IP address. Let's go ahead and get started. So we'll begin by signing up for a Professional Plus plan on the IPstack API website. You need the Professional Plus level plan to access the advanced security module feature of this API. Once you've signed up, you'll land on your dashboard where you can see your API access key and links to documentation. Let's go ahead and take a look at the documentation. The part that we are mostly concerned with here is the security module. So if you look on the left-hand side here, you'll see a link to enable security module, and that's going to tell you how to do that. It's really easy to do. Basically, all you need to do is append security equals 1 to the end of the request that you send to IPstack. So you're going to send the base URL along with the IP address that you want analyzed, your access key, and then you're going to add security equals 1 to the end of that string. Let's run a test request here and take a look at the response that IPstack sends back. So if we pretty print this in the browser, we can see that that's the IP address that IPstack uses to run these test requests. And at the bottom here is this additional object called security, which provides all of the information that we are going to use to determine the threat level of this IP address. The way we're going to do that is by assigning a risk score to each parameter of that security object. So for each value, we're going to look at that value, and then based on what it is, we're going to assign a number. And then at the end, we'll total up all of those numbers to determine the risk score overall. These numbers are really up to you. There are some best practices and then some domain knowledge that can help you determine what is the right score to assign for each parameter. If you want a little bit more in-depth on this, you can take a look at the written version of this tutorial, which digs a little bit more into these actual weights and how we determined those. So we're ready with IPstack. That means we're going to go ahead and actually start building our app. So we'll start by just making a directory to store our app, and then we're going to go into that directory and we're going to create a directory inside there called server. And then inside that server directory, we are going to initialize it as a Node project using npm init. It's going to take us through this little setup wizard that will establish our package.json file and get everything set up. And then we're going to create an index.js file. This is the main file where we will build our server. The next thing we'll do is install our dependencies. We're going to use Express, which is a framework for quickly building servers in Node. And we're also going to install .env, which is going to allow us to create a .env file to keep our secrets, like our API access key, nice and secure. So now we can go ahead and open up the project in our code editor. I'm using VS Code here, and we'll take a look at this index file. Inside the index file, we are going to put the code for our server. So first thing we're doing here is we're requiring Express, which is our framework, and then we are using Express to create a server and calling that server app. We're assigning it to a port, and we're just going to use port 3000, and then we are building one route here. This route we're going to call /API/fraud score, and this is the route that's going to accept incoming requests from our client and handle those requests. For now, we're just sending a response back to the client. That's a string that says hello world. And then we're going to start the app on port 3000 by telling it app.listen, and we'll just console log a little message there to show that it's working. So if we go back to the terminal, we start the server by running node index.js, and you can see there's our little message getting logged to the console. And then we go to the browser and we go to localhost 3000/API/fraud score, and you can see it's sending back this little hello world message. So now we're ready to actually start building out the functionality of this route. Right now, all it's doing is sending a stringified response, but we actually want it to do quite a number of things. First, we want to accept the incoming request from our front end. Then we want to forward the IP address of that request to the IPstack Security Implementation API, We want to get the response from the API back that's going to include that security data object. We're going to analyze the security data using an IP risk scoring algorithm that we create using those weights. We're going to determine the threat level of the request, and then we're going to assign it a fraud score, and we're going to return that score to the front end. We've already done step 1, so now we need to work on step 2, which is forwarding the IP address to the IPstack API. Before we can do that, we need to get our access key, which means we need to create a .env file. So we'll come over here and we're just going to right click and create a new file and call it .env. Remember, we've already installed the .env module, so all we need to do is create the file and then add our secrets to it. And the reason we do this is because you need to keep your API access key really secure. You can't just be committing it to online repositories and that kind of thing. So you put it in this .env file, which never gets committed to GitHub or anything like that. We'll put the API base URL in this file too, even though that doesn't really need to remain secret. It's just kind of convenient to have it in the same place as the API access key. And then when we go back into our server file, we can now require the .env framework, and then we can just pull those values right off of this handy little thing called process.env that Node is now supplying for us. And then we're going to use these to send the request to the API. So let's go ahead and do that. The first thing we want to do in order to send this IP address to the API is we need to pull it off of the incoming request. And it's actually really easy to do that with Express, because Express provides you with this really handy little request object that you can just grab the IP from, and then we can send it to IPstack. IPstack will analyze it and send it back. And then we will decide based on that response what the fraud score is, and then we will return that fraud score to the client so the client can do whatever it wants to do with that. The issue with this is that during development, we kind of run into a problem because the IP address that we are getting, as you can see, we're logging here the example app, and then we're also logging that IP address. This IP address is just the IPv6 address of the local host, because remember, right now, we're running this app in development and we are just hitting this server from localhost 3000 in the browser. So the IP address that's coming through there is this localhost IP address, which isn't actually very useful for us. If we send that to IPstack, IPstack's not going to have any information about it. What we need is a public-facing IP address to send to IPstack so that we can at least build this app out in development. So what we're going to do is we're going to mock out a public-facing IP address by running a reverse proxy server using Nginx. And we're going to go ahead and set that up right now. So this sounds super complicated, but it's actually really not all that difficult. The first thing we need to do is install Nginx using Homebrew, which you can easily do in the terminal by just running brew install Nginx. And it'll download a bunch of things. Mine's already been installed, so you can see here it's telling me you've already installed it. If you want to reinstall it, run this. And then what you're going to do is you're going to edit the Nginx configuration file, and you can find that file at this path that I'm showing you here. VS Code makes it super easy to do this. You can just paste the path into the search bar and it will load the file right into VS Code for you. So I'm now editing this Nginx conf file, and I'm going to add this server block to it. Make sure you add it in the HTTP section of the file. But basically what we're doing is we're telling Nginx to run a server on localhost 8080. So that's a different port. It's going to forward our 8080 requests to our Express server on 3000. And when it forwards that request, it's going to attach this simulated client IP address for us. And I'm just using the same IP address that IPstack uses in their documentation when we sent that test request earlier. This is that same IP address. So this is just for development purposes. This is just to give us something to work with while we are running this app on localhost. The final thing we have to do to make this setup work is we need to tell our Express app on port 3000 to trust the incoming proxied requests from Nginx. So we're going to go app.set trust proxy true, and that will make that happen. Now, instead of going to port 3000 in the browser, we're going to go to port, and it doesn't work because, why doesn't it work? Oh, because I need to restart I need to start Nginx, basically. So don't forget to start the Nginx server. You can do that with brew services start or restart Nginx. And so that's now running. So our proxy server is now running on port 8080. That request is being forwarded to port 3000, and port 3000 is now sending back that. And as you can see, we're now logging a real IP address here, which is the one we're going to send to IPstack. So let's go ahead and do that part now. So in our API/fraud score route, we can now delete everything that we had there before, and we're going to put in a request to IPstack. We need to make this an async function now because we're sending a network request. And basically, we're just going to pull the IP address off the request object. We're going to create a query string by stringing together our base URL, our IP address, our access key, and then that security equals 1 parameter that tells the API to send us security information about this IP address. We're going to wait for the response. We're going to get that response, and then we're just going to log it to the console. And we'll send a little hello world response back to the client because we need to send something. So now if we hit that endpoint again at localhost 8080, you can see we're getting that hello world response back to the client. And then in the server logs, we can see we're logging that response from the API. So there's the IP address that we sent, and here's all the information that the API sent back to us about that IP address, including the security object, which is what we're going to use to determine the threat level of this IP address. So to quickly recap here, we have forwarded the IP address to IPstack, we have received a response that includes the security data, and now we're going to analyze that security data using the weights that we established before to determine how risky that IP address is. The way we're going to do that is we're going to create a helper function inside a file called fraudscore.js. And I'm just going to paste this in here because it is quite long, and then we'll just walk through it. So I've called this calculate fraud score, and it takes that security object that was returned to us by the API. And we'll start out with a score of 0, and then we're basically just going to walk through every parameter on that object and add a numerical value based on those weights that we looked at earlier. So as you can see, an elite proxy, we think that's pretty risky. But just a distorting or transparent proxy, we don't think that is quite so risky. Down here you can see like our proxy types. If it's a Tor proxy, we think that's pretty risky, but these ones we don't think are so risky. And we just keep going. We analyze every parameter of that object. We add a little bit more to the score, depending on what it is. And then when we get to the end, we are going to return an object with a numerical value for our raw score, and then a risk level that we have determined using a couple of helper functions here that's basically going to tell us whether this is a severe threat, a high threat, a moderate threat, or just a low threat. So now, if we go back to index.js, instead of just logging the data that we got back from the API to the console, we are going to create a fraud score from it. So we'll call it fraud score, and we'll do it by basically passing that data into that function. So as you can see, that function then just got required up here. It got imported for us. Thanks, VS Code. That's very helpful. And then instead of sending back just this hello world string, we're actually going to send back that fraud score object. So let's just quickly recap what this route is doing for us. The client hits API/fraud score. We go ahead and pull off the client's IP address. We send that IP address to IPstack. IPstack sends us back some data, some security information about that IP address. We use that to determine how risky the address is, and then we send a fraud score back to the client so the client can decide what they want to do with this user. So now I'll restart the server here just to pick up those changes, and then if I go back to the browser and I refresh the page, you'll see that instead of hello world, we're now getting back that fraud score object. And as you can see, this particular IP address, IPstack, and we together have determined that it is a pretty low risk IP address. So we analyzed the security data, we determined the threat level of the request and assigned it a fraud score, and then we returned that fraud score to the client. So now it's really up to the client to decide what they want to do with that. And so some next steps here could be maybe you want to build a web app login page where the first step in determining the authenticity or safety of a user is to validate their email address. And then maybe you use this IP threat detecting server to analyze the threat level of their IP address. There is in fact a tutorial through API layer called the Mailbox Layer API tutorial where we show you how to build a front end that accepts a user's email address and validates that email. So I might recommend as a next step after this tutorial that you go ahead and check out that other tutorial and see if you can hook these two together to create a really nice, secure, robust front end. So that's it for this tutorial. Thanks so much for watching. Please go ahead and check out the IPstack API. There is a free tier that you can use to send up to 100 free requests per month. You don't get the security data on the free tier, but there is a lot of other information there that you can use to build out some apps. And then again, go ahead and check out the Mailbox Layer tutorial as well if you're interested in building out a really robust web login page. Thanks so much. See you next time.